When it comes to nuclear weapons, the US is one of the biggest players on the block. Worldwide, there are approximately 15,000 nuclear warheads, and about 6,500 of them are in the United States. With the destructive force of 50 million tons of TNT in just one warhead alone, not to mention the radioactive fallout, it's pretty crazy these things are lying around waiting to kill us all. So here are 10 surprising facts about the US nuclear weapons program. Number 10. Curtis LeMay. Curtis LeMay was a famous Air Force general appointed by John F. Kennedy. He was also known as a bit of a madman. On the Sunday morning in '62, when Khrushchev announced he was dismantling his missiles in Cuba, LeMay told Kennedy he should go ahead and attack Cuba anyway. LeMay also liked to go rogue. Without telling his commanders in World War II, LeMay launched a bombing raid against innocent civilians in Tokyo, resulting in the deadliest fire in recorded Western history. And when he was asked whether the President of the United States should be involved in a nuclear weapon launch process, LeMay said no. In fact, he said, quote, "After all, who is more qualified to make that decision? Some politician who may have been in office for a couple months, or a man who has been preparing his whole life to make it?" It was a shocking admission. Who's in control of the nuclear weapons in the United States? The president or the US military? Number 9. Delegation of Power. In 1959, Nuclear Control Officer Admiral Harry D. Felt received a curious letter from President Eisenhower. It was signed by Eisenhower himself, and it gave Felt the authority to launch nuclear weapons on his own accord if he felt the circumstances warranted such decision, and if communications were out between Washington and his base in Hawaii. This was a watershed moment and reflects an uncomfortable fact about the US nuclear weapons program. It turns out the whole football nuclear code's presidential suitcase rigmarole is just for show. In fact, the authority to launch nuclear weapons has been delegated to all military theater commanders, and in some circumstances, 4-star generals can delegate the authority even further down the chain of command. In other words, there are many people with their finger on the button. In many ways, it's a miracle it hasn't happened already. Number 8. The Japanese Stash. A major element of Japan's treaty with the US after Hiroshima was that it forbade the development, possession, or introduction of nuclear weapons in Japan. But there was one small base at Iwakuni, Japan, that had a secret arrangement whereby a handful of planes would get their nuclear weapons immediately. How? It turns out there was a flat-bottomed ship called an LST, which was loaded with nuclear bombs and anchored just offshore. The official cover for this ship was that it was an electronics repair vessel. The crazy part is that neither the Secretary of Defense nor the President knew about this clear treaty violation. When the Chief of Naval Operations was confronted, he thought it was completely unacceptable for the Secretary of Defense to tell the Navy where to put its ships. Once again, it's not quite clear who's in control, the President or the US military. Number 7. The human toll. If thermonuclear war was to break out between Russia and the United States, the results would be catastrophic. Nearly 600 million would be dead within months, almost entirely civilians. Moreover, the fallout from the explosions would impact neutral countries like Sweden, Austria, Afghanistan, and Japan. Given prevailing wind patterns, the Finns would be virtually wiped out. But it turns out that the war planners at the Pentagon don't factor in the most destructive factor of a nuclear explosion: the firestorms. The damage radius of firestorms would be 2 to 5 times the radius destroyed by the blast, and that would bring casualties closer to a third of the world's population. And then there's the smoke. Millions of tons of soot would shoot into the stratosphere, blocking most sunlight around the Earth for a decade or more. Most humans would starve to death. Number 6. Uncontrollable fires. In their bombing runs during World War II, the Royal Air Force realized fire was much better than high explosive bombs to destroy a city. On July 27, 1943, the Royal Air Force successfully created a firestorm in the city of Hamburg. Using a squadron of planes en masse, they dropped pattern area magnesium thermite bombs, starting lots of tiny fires at the same time. But first, they drop big high explosive bombs to break up the streets and block fire trucks. The fires soon join together in one massive conflagration. As this happens, super hot air rose, creating a low pressure area, turning the city into a furnace. In Hamburg that night, temperatures rose to 1500 Fahrenheit. A German doctor found melted fat tissue and shrunken bodies. So if a nuclear bomb goes off in your town, you probably won't turn to dust, just melt into a puddle of goo. Number 5, clearance. If you deal with nuclear secrets in the United States, chances are you have keyhole clearance. Keyhole or K clearance is a well-kept secret, and even the existence of such clearances is a highly kept secret. There are established procedures if you want to speak to someone with keyhole clearance but aren't sure if they know about the program. Here's how it works. First, you go to a Pentagon phone and call a special number and give an identifying ID code. Then you ask, is this other person cleared for keyhole access? If the answer is yes, you go back and invite the other person to go check out your clearance using the same process. Failure to follow these procedures results in immediate revocation of classified access, sanctions, and absolute pariah status in the military and intelligence community. There are other letters of classified clearance like SI for signals intelligence and some other ones we don't even know about. Number 4, the nuclear codes. There's an ironclad rule in the military. 2 officers with the nuclear codes must be on duty at all times, and they both must be involved and agree to the launch. To add another layer of security, the United States requires 2 different launch sites to agree. If one site is destroyed, the other side can still launch their weapons if a predetermined period has elapsed. The scary part is that interval is often set to 0, which effectively allows one side to unilaterally launch a nuke. But it gets worse. John F. Kennedy, Secretary of Defense, required all missiles to have a launch code that would have to be supplied from higher headquarters. Years later, it turned out that the Air Force had sent all of the control center codes to 00000000. That was the secret password that would unleash Armageddon on this planet. Number 3, the man who saved the world. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviets sent 4 submarines to the Caribbean. To avoid any miscalculations, the US told the Russians if they encountered any of these subs, they would drop essentially hand grenades down on the sub that would not damage the exterior but give them a clear warning to surface immediately. The problem was the Soviet submarines didn't get the message. So when the Americans started dropping hand grenades on their hull, they thought they were under attack. Even worse, all of the submarines had broken down because they had never been in warm water before. It was 140 degrees in the main compartments. Carbon dioxide was building up and the crew was fainting. The captain of the ship decided to ready the nuclear torpedo for battle. His second officer agreed. Each had one half of a key required to fire the missile, but in a twist of fate, the chief of the staff of the brigade was on board and he refused because they had not received the order from Moscow, saving the world from a potentially devastating thermonuclear exchange. Number 2, the U-2 plane. If you thought that was a close call, it gets even worse. While this whole submarine business was happening, a U-2 plane crossed into Soviet airspace. As the story goes, the pilot was confused by the northern lights over the North Pole and went in the wrong direction. By the time he realized where he was over the Chukotka Peninsula in the Soviet Union. Running out of fuel, the pilot turned around and proceeded to glide for miles, unaware that MiGs had already been scrambled to shoot him down. Meanwhile, the Alaskan Air Command scrambled F-102A fighters to protect the U-2. But these planes were designed to intercept Russian bombers coming over the North Pole, and they were armed only with nuclear air-to-air missiles. If they intercepted the MiGs, a thermonuclear exchange was almost certain to occur. Luckily, they missed the MiGs, and the U-2 glided safely back to base. Number 1, Project Retro. When it comes to harebrained military ideas, Project Retro pretty much takes the cake. This was a program developed by the Air Force in the 1960s to deal with the problem of Russian missiles going over the North Pole and hitting US missile silos in the Midwest. To deal with this threat, they figured out a way, they thought, to momentarily stop the Earth from spinning. This would cause the Russian missiles to miss their target. How? By taking 1,000 rockets and bolting them to the Earth and point them in the opposite direction of the spin. When they see the Russian missiles, the idea was to turn 1,000 of these rockets on and momentarily halt the Earth's rotation. When geophysicists reviewed the plan, it had a few problems. Super hurricane force winds would create giant tsunamis, not to mention all structures on Earth collapsing. Luckily, the project wasn't funded. It's truly a miracle our planet has survived as long as it has. What's even more surprising is how many people around the world actually have their finger on the button. The idea that nuclear codes are closely guarded is really a bit of a farce. If you enjoyed this list, subscribe to Decagon and join our growing community.